Good afternoon, everyone. I am Erin Pollard, the Project Officer for ERIC in the Institute of Education Sciences, the independent research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. Today, I would like to welcome you to our webinar, where we're going to talk to you about recent updates to the ERIC selection policy. These updates are intended to clarify and strengthen some of our existing policies and procedures, and make them more transparent for our content providers in the ERIC community. The updates are based on our team's experience implementing the selection policy on a day-to-day basis and take into account the feedback and questions we've received from publishers, authors, and ERIC users. We are seeking feedback from the public on these changes. As you listen to the presentation today, if you have thoughts about things you think we can improve or think we should change, please feel free to raise them in the Q&A or email us at ericrequests@ed.gov. Before we get started, I have just a couple housekeeping items. First, we muted everyone to reduce the noise during our presentation. If you have a question, please enter in the Q&A box. We've muted the chat, but the Q&A box is available. We'll address your questions or comments at the end of our presentation, but feel free to ask questions as we go along. Also, you can turn on closed captioning by clicking the three dots at the top right of your screen and then selecting closed captioning from the drop-down menu. Finally, we are recording the webinar and it will be available on YouTube in a few weeks, and there'll be a link on the ERIC multimedia site. You'll be getting an email from us to let you know when it's online. Okay, today you're going to hear from two members of the ERIC team, starting with me. I'll provide some background on the selection policy and how it supports ERIC's mission, and then let you know where to find the policy online if you'd like to provide us with feedback. Then I'm going to turn it over to Fern Fresti, the collection development lead, who's going to walk you through the key updates to the policy. So to start, we're going to look at the ERIC mission statement, which is provided at the beginning of the selection policy. The mission statement was updated to make it clearer and more concise. We made this update to more clearly define ERIC's purpose and convey how the work of ERIC supports the mission of IES. Since the mission statement sets the stage for the rest of the policy, I'll read it in full. ERIC's mission is to select, index, and make quality education research widely available and searchable through a user-friendly website. This supports the mission of IES to provide scientific evidence on which to ground education practice and policy, and to share this information in formats that are useful and accessible to educators, parents, policymakers, researchers, and the public. So how does the selection policy support the ERIC mission statement? Since the ERIC collection is the heart of ERIC, it is critical that we conduct our collection development work in accordance with a carefully considered vision and roadmap. Our vision and priorities for meeting the needs of our key audience, our nation's educators, parents, policymakers, researchers, and the public, are reflected in our collection development goals. The ERIC selection standard and criteria provide the roadmap we use to ensure the inclusion of high quality, rigorous, and relevant research in ERIC. The standard and criteria make it possible for us to select, index, and make quality research widely available in a consistent and reliable manner. Another important aspect of how the policy relates to the preservation of content. The research community depends on ERIC to provide a stable collection and make it searchable through a user-friendly website. To ensure that historical research is preserved and search results from a systematic reviews are replicable, we communicate our policy on the content preservation in the selection policy. To communicate our current vision, processes, and policies, and give you a chance to provide us with comments or feedback, we made the draft updated selection policy available for public comment. Please send us your comments by April 8th, that is next Friday, to ericrequests@ed.gov. We're looking forward to hearing your feedback. You can find the draft policy at the URL on this slide. You can also go to the selection policy link in the footer of the ERIC website. You may want to have a copy of the policy open as we go through this presentation. Now I'd like to introduce Fern Fresti, who's going to walk you through the key updates. Fern, I think you are muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin, and good afternoon. While the primary focus and scope of the ERIC collection does not change from year to year, we periodically review and modify the selection policy to support our collection development goals and the priorities of IES. There may also be updates needed to align the document with our current work policies and processes and communicate how ERIC is currently operating. This year, our review led to the addition of a collection goal and 2 selection criteria. Other key changes were to add new text to the sections about the source review process and the preservation policy. We also restructured the section about the online submission system and made updates to the tables of material ERIC indexes or does not index. You will immediately notice obvious formatting changes. We added a front cover, a table of contents, and Appendix A containing brief descriptions for the 16 topic areas. We did this to better reflect IES branding and to indicate that this is an IES policy document. Please note that none of the updates to the selection policy mean that currently indexed sources will need to reapply. If you have the updated selection policy document open, ERIC's collection development goals begin on page 2. The purpose of establishing goals is to give guidance and a long-term vision for the direction of ERIC's collection development activities. The goals serve as a guide when we apply the selection standard and criteria to select sources of content to be indexed in ERIC. The goals also ensure that we have a well-rounded collection of rigorous and relevant materials that meet the needs of ERIC's audience. The first goal remains the same and is also the selection standard required of every approved source, that it produces education research relevant to an education topic area. We seek sources for regular indexing to also contribute to one other collection goal. We want to increase the number of peer-reviewed full-text sources, typically journal publishers who permit the full text to display in ERIC. We also want to increase the number of rigorous and relevant non-peer-reviewed but full-text materials from non-journal sources. Meanwhile, we wish to limit citation-only indexing to materials that may not be available full-text in ERIC, but are among the most rigorous and relevant to contemporary issues in education policy and practice, such as content produced by commercial journal publishers. We periodically evaluate the published content in ERIC to determine how the collection is meeting each of these goals. This year, we added a new goal located at the top of page 3 of the selection policy. The new goal is to prioritize sources with content including participants in the United States. Because ERIC is sponsored by IES, which is the Statistics, Research, and Evaluation arm of the U.S. Department of Education, we must be sure that we are indexing content that is most aligned with the needs of U.S.-based audiences. ERIC supports the mission of IES, which Aaron discussed earlier. Please note that this is a collection goal and it is not a selection criteria. It is important for ERIC to be a well-rounded collection and include resources that illuminate, compare, and/or contrast global education systems and issues. We will continue to index high-quality materials published in English from countries where the participants are not from the United States, if the content fits into ERIC's selection criteria. The content contributed from around the world is valuable for all education researchers. But this goal gives us guidance as we support IES and provides us the discretion and the flexibility to prioritize content that directly serves our mission. Now let's move on to the one selection standard required of all sources indexed in ERIC. If you have the updated selection policy open, we are on page 3. The content must be related to one or more of the 16 topics in the field of education. This remains unchanged. The 16 topic areas listed on the slide are based on the IES authorizing legislation in the Education Sciences Reform Act of 2002, and they originate from ERIC's previous network of 16 subject-specific clearinghouses. The only update is that we've added a brief description of each in Appendix A. We've also added a link in the document to the ERIC topic area webpage that lists all the currently indexed journal and non-journal sources by the topic area that most closely aligns with the scope of the source. Internally, we assign up to 3 topic areas to every source we're indexing to give us a broader understanding of ERIC's coverage of the field of education. There are 7 selection criteria that are applied to all sources indexed in ERIC. All sources selected for indexing in ERIC must meet all 7 criteria. The first is quality, and this is on page 3 of the selection policy. No updates were made to the criteria of quality this year. The second selection criteria is peer review. There are no updates to the description of the types of peer review ERIC accepts for the indicator to be placed on the ERIC records or how the indicator is determined. However, we did address the quick turnaround from receipt to publish that a few journals promote. We reviewed some journals who indicate that they will publish in just 2 to 4 weeks after receiving the article, including time for peer review, editing, and publishing. Because a thorough peer review process involves feedback from 1 or more reviewers and time may be needed for revision, we expect that a scholarly review may take several weeks or even months and should not be rushed. To indicate that we consider the time from receipt to publication, we've added, a peer review process often takes several rounds and revisions. Let's move on now to the selection criteria of language on pages 4 and 5 of the updated selection policy. All materials indexed in ERIC must be written in English or have high-quality English translation. We've made a few minor updates to this section. Some of the sources we review originate outside of the U.S., and we need to be able to gather a variety of background information from their website. We've added the expectation that all website information about the journal will be available in English. We will accept a translation link on their site, but will not apply a translation program in order to gather background information. We also strengthened 2 points for any journal publishing some articles in English and others in another language. We increased our flexibility to select these journals based on the content's contribution to the coverage of a topic area by removing the specific requirement that 80% of the articles in every issue are available in English. However, we will continue to prefer that at least 80% of the articles in every issue are available in English. We also added a clarification that while they must provide the full text to us if selected, to confirm that the articles indexed are available in English, the publisher is not required to display the full text in ERIC. The selection criteria of material format is on page 5 of the selection policy. ERIC's workflow system for record creation only accepts content in PDF and XML format. We've removed the reference to not receive print format as it is no longer an expectation of publishers. And we've added a statement about 2 currently used formats. We cannot accept scanned image files saved as a PDF or content available in only an interactive format. The selection criteria of publisher evaluation is also on page 5. When reviewing a new source of content, we consider the policies and procedures of the publisher, their transparency, and their reputation. We began by updating the heading from Publisher and Editorial Procedures to the broader name of Publisher Evaluation. Then, because this selection criteria is always applied, we updated the introductory statement from journal sources may also be subject to a review of policies and processes to are also subject to a review. This section retains the guidelines from the previous version of the selection policy, but we have merged related statements or rewritten a few to more clearly define what we are looking for. We have also added some expectations. First, the content should reflect the source name as well as the aim and scope statement. We reviewed a few journals where the content is not an obvious match to the journal title. For example, a journal that includes American in the name, but the content is not published in the U.S. and is not about education in the United States or any country on the South or North American continents. Or perhaps the journal title includes science education, but we find articles from the arts or politics included in the issues. Next, we expect that a publisher's website should include complete, accurate and up-to-date information. Sometimes the publisher has less than complete information on their website, such as no indication of the country where their journal originates, or the website is not kept up to date. And unfortunately, sometimes misinformation is included, such as a contributing author listed as on an editorial board. We've also found examples where the journal website states that they are included in EBSCO, but they are not on a current EBSCO product list. One other addition to this section is an expectation that the source's website should be fully functional and accessible without error messages. We've also incorporated the previous criteria of sponsorship into this section because it relates to the consideration of the publisher. Sponsorship has been and remains a preference, but not a requirement. This year, we determined that 2 working practices should be listed as selection criteria. The first is regarding the maturity and currency of the content and is located now on the bottom of page 5 of the draft selection policy. For maturity, while we want to index news sources responding to emerging topics or trends, our preference is that news sources have published a minimum of 3 years before applying for review to be indexed in ERIC. For currency, we expect a source selected for indexing in ERIC to have a regular publishing schedule and indicate the most current material on their website as it is published. As an ongoing requirement for currency, if we are indexing a source and it does not publish for more than 18 months, it is no longer considered current. Or if they stop providing the newest content for indexing, they may no longer be considered current. Lack of currency may be a reason to discontinue indexing the source. In both these situations, we reach out to the publisher representative before making a decision to change an active source's status to inactive. The other news selection criteria on page 6 of the policy is to evaluate if a source is accessible enough to the public to warrant inclusion in ERIC. For years, we've taken into account whether there is a way for users to acquire the full text of content that is indexed in ERIC. We have now added language to the selection policy to explain how we apply this requirement. Open access on the publisher's website does meet this criteria. Such publishers are also very likely to allow ERIC to display the full text, which would be our preference. However, even if the publisher doesn't permit the full text to display in ERIC, the direct link on the ERIC record will bring users to the full text on the publisher's website. If the content is not open access on the publisher's website, we then consider the number of subscribing libraries to allow users to access the full text through an interlibrary loan. Member-only content may not meet this criteria because it does restrict access. This type of journal material may only be indexed if libraries subscribe to it, and non-journal material may only be indexed if a publisher has permitted the content to display in ERIC after an embargo. ERIC reviews sources twice a year, in the spring and the fall. The process to review sources and interact with publishers to seek permission to index the new material in ERIC is explained starting on page 6 of the selection policy. We updated the prioritization statement that preference is given to sources funded by the department to add and sources that contribute to the collection goals. For actions that happen after the review of a potential source, we added a new policy statement about when ERIC will re-review a source that has not been selected for inclusion. Rather than allowing a publisher to request another review immediately, we have established a waiting period of 2 years after the first review is completed. In addition, we will not review a potential source more than 3 times in a 10-year period. The section about the inclusion of materials from approved sources begins on page 7 of the selection policy. During the source review and approval process, ERIC determines if the source will be indexed comprehensively or selectively. Journals found to contain 80% or more education research articles are comprehensively indexed, which means that all articles received after the source was selected are indexed. Approved journals needed for topic area coverage in ERIC, but contain education research in only 50 to 79% of the articles, are selectively indexed. This means that ERIC applies a manual article-by-article review and indexes only the articles with a focus on education research. We set that coverage level when a journal is first approved, but if we find that the percentage of education research has changed, we will update the coverage level. We've added a paragraph to this section to add transparency. Comprehensive coverage is not guaranteed, and a journal may be switched between being comprehensively or selectively indexed at any time. Also, if the percentage of education research drops below 50%, a review will be conducted to determine if ERIC should continue indexing the journal. The preservation policy is located on page 8 of the selection policy. As a repository of historical materials, the preservation of content in ERIC is important for research purposes. We have occasionally received emails expressing concern about outdated language and research methodologies used in some of ERIC's older content. ERIC will not remove a record or the full text content if there is a complaint for these reasons. I would like to read the statement we've added to the preservation policy on page 8. The content of publications in ERIC may not reflect the views or policies of IES or the U.S. Department of Education, including language or terminology, viewpoints, or framing of research questions, but these are not grounds for the removal of an ERIC record or full text. The information about the online submission system that individuals may use to submit a report or paper to ERIC is on page 9 of the selection policy. The policies remain the same in this section, but we've restructured it to add clarity. A new section called Copyright and Full Text Display for Online Submissions has been added to highlight these two important policies, and some information has been reorganized as it applies directly to grantee submissions or to other individual online submissions. Journal publishers may now agree to submit grantee or contractor work to ERIC on their behalf. We've added this new policy and a link to the list of participating sources on the ERIC website. Lastly, we removed the paragraph about the types of materials eligible for online submission as it duplicates the tables of material that ERIC indexes. The types of materials indexed in ERIC table begins on page 10. It was updated to condense some entries, remove redundancy, and more specifically define types of material. For example, we merged information analyses and policy analyses and instead created a single entry for analyses. We merged conference presentations, proceedings, speeches, and created one entry called Conference or Meeting Publications. We also merged the congressional or legislative entries and all federal, state, or local entries to create one entry for each category. Other types of minor cleanup were also done. We removed the descriptive word educational from 2 entry names and from some of the descriptions because this can be assumed. For example, educational guides and educational finance information are now simply guides and finance information. We added new entries for terms specifically found within various descriptions. We added briefs, data profiles, and studies. And in an effort to align the entries to name just types of publications, we changed position, opinion papers to simply papers. We also changed serial publications to monographic series, as the other serial items in the previous description are now covered by entries for briefs, papers, and newsletters. We also removed the entry for reference materials and included this in the description for books. We also made a few updates to the types of materials not indexed in ERIC, and this is on page 12. Because we've clearly stated in the material format criteria what types of formats are acceptable, we've removed several references to older formats we do not accept, such as audio tapes, CD-ROMs, DVDs, and videotapes. The only addition to the table is interviews. But we did make a few updates to clarify some of the entries. For example, we qualified the entry for book reviews to add, unless comparing several works on the same subject, to indicate a situation in which the content might be indexed. Because some of our non-journal publishers produce summaries of a product as well as research results, we've added to the entry for business advertisements and solicitations that we would not index reports summarizing the result of a commercial product. And while we do not need to list most other formats, we felt it was important to be clear that we cannot index content in YouTube videos or other digitized formats. This was added to the entry for webinars or podcasts. That concludes the review of the recent updates to the ERIC selection policy. I want to thank you for taking time away from your busy schedules to join us today. And now I'd like to turn the meeting back to Erin for our wrap-up and the question and answer time.
Hi, Fern. Thanks so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us to review the updates to the ERIC selection policy. As we said earlier, if you have questions or feedback after the webinar, please feel free to email us at ericrequests@ed.gov, and we'll consider all feedback received by next Friday, that's April 8th. Also, if you would like to hear about other events like this, we suggest that you sign up for our newsflash, and the URL should be on the screen. The newsflash will notify you about upcoming ERIC webinars and will provide newsworthy updates. To get the ERIC sign up, click on the link for the National Center for Education Evaluation, and you'll see ERIC in the drop-down list. You can also find out more about ERIC by visiting our multimedia and our FAQ pages on the ERIC website. So now we're going to take a look at your questions and comments. So again, please use that Q&A feature to enter your either feedback or questions. All right, so we have one question so far that we've seen, and then I have a couple that had been submitted earlier. And the question before is asking whether or not IES would permit the use of the singular form criteria, which is criterion, when referring to a single criteria. And the answer to that is that the IES style guide is created by a central office, and we will have them double check, but we certainly, I cannot imagine, we will certainly, if we are referring to one criterion, use that. So thank you for pointing that out. Okay, the next question I have is, even with the new goal that prioritizes content with participants in the United States, will ERIC still include comparative research or some research that's specific to a country's population? And the answer to this is yes. So while ERIC has an international reach, and we love that it has an international reach, it has always been a US-based database of education research because it's funded by the US Department of Education. And so our primary audience by statute is educators, researchers, policymakers, and others based in the US. So we added this new goal to be clear that ERIC is funded with US tax dollars, and therefore the priority of our collection development efforts is to include research relevant to the United States. But setting this as a priority does not preclude research with non-US participants, but it does give us flexibility when we're reviewing new sources and content to find the best balance for our collection. Okay, next. So how does ERIC determine the number of libraries in which a journal can be accessed? And I am going to turn this over to Fern to talk a little bit about how she does, goes through and looks at the different ways to determine how well or how many libraries have access to a journal. Fern?
Hi, Erin. Yes. What we do is we find the number of libraries subscribing by going to WorldCat. We look at both print and electronic format, as some libraries assign their ownership to one or the other. And we do keep an eye on it. So if a new journal has initially 5 or 10 libraries subscribing to it, and we know it's a new journal, combined with that information, we'll put it on our watch list. And 6 months later, we'll go back and take a look at it again. We really like to have at least 30 libraries subscribing to it, so that the access is a bit easier throughout the United States.
Great, thank you. So Fern, I have another question for you. It is, will proceedings that are not peer-reviewed but reviewed by an editorial board related to educational content still be accepted?
By an editorial board? No, we have a lot of conference proceedings that go through a full peer review process, that they set up external reviewers, but anything that is just selected for inclusion by an editorial board does not meet the peer review criteria.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, are there exact dates, like specific months, that journals are reviewed in the fall and the spring? And so the answer is that yes, there are incredibly specific dates, but the dates do vary and do change, and they're tied to a whole bunch of stuff in government land. So typically when we are looking for journals in the fall, we are, and spring, there's not one hard and fast cutoff date. And we typically align things to be, I would say, I'm going to punt to Fern because she's more familiar with the calendar than I am. But typically, Fern, what are your cutoff dates that you want to see journals nominated?
I think the fall schedule we typically run September, October, November. But any of the review cycles, we're looking at new sources over a 3-month period, and then we have to do a cutoff in order to make some final decisions and make the recommendations. The spring is more likely March, April, May. We've just now started the spring review cycle, and then it is normally July, August when publishers are notified. Or after the fall one, it's more like February when publishers are notified.
Yeah. Thank you. So then the next question is, will the new selection criteria be applied retroactively to sources that are currently actively indexed in ERIC? So the key answer to this, and I'm going to ask her to chime in after me to make sure I get this right, is that anything that is currently indexed in ERIC is staying in ERIC. We don't go back and we don't remove stuff from ERIC. That's a key part of our preservation policy. But every source selection, we look to make sure our sources are still a good fit for ERIC. So there may be sources that would be discontinued if they no longer meet the new selection policy. Fern, do you have anything that you want to add?
No, yeah, that's exactly right. There isn't anything. The major updates this time were the goal, which is going to be applied going forward and is something that we're going to try to increase. And even the 2 new selection criteria for working policies that we have been applying anyway. So there's no impact to anything that we're currently indexing.
Great. All right, so then we have a question of, so this person has a journal that changed URLs. What's the best way to update this information in ERIC? So email it to us at ericrequests@ed.gov, that email address on the screen, and we will get that updated in your new records first, and then as time and resources allow, we may be able to update it in older records as well. But that is our priority, is to get the new records to be accurate. And then also, what would be helpful is if you do not allow ERIC to display the full text, and instead you have a direct link to your website, your links are going to break. That is going to be very frustrating to users. So what would be helpful would be to reach out to figure out how to send us the new links and what would be the best format, so that way we can update your broken links. So that way your content will be used. All right. So then we have a comment that said it would be great if ERIC pays special attention to the potential predator publishers. And all I can say is thank you for that comment. We are certainly aware of this, and we are trying to find ways through this policy to say what we want, because for us, the department, to say someone is predatory, that is a value judgment. So we find it better to say, what are we looking for in an ideal publisher? But we certainly appreciate the sentiment. I know it's a big issue in publishing. Okay. Then, so we have a question who, from what I am going to guess, is an existing publisher. And the publisher said, so I need to give some background to this question, is that ERIC sends out publishers a list of their top 10 most viewed articles in the past 6 months, as well as the total number of article views and downloads in the past 6 months. And the question we have is saying that the top 10 views of articles are highly valuable, and is it possible to obtain an extended list beyond the top 10 views? So right now, we just launched this in the past few years. We don't have the resources to do that, but I will certainly take that under consideration to see if we can look into expanding that as resources allow. And what I would ask from you, the field, while you're here, is to email us at that ERIC request inbox to say what types of information are you looking for? Because the more information you can give us up front, the more we can scope out as we're looking to improve those metrics reports. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions. Okay, I see. Okay, so I have a few more. So it says, now that you have removed the requirement of 80% of articles in a journal must be in English, does that mean that you'll be indexing journals that have less than 80% of their articles in English? So the answer here is we might, but we must remove that criterion to sharpen our focus on what content would contribute to the collection instead of focusing on as much on a percentage measure. So the previous requirement was also applied per issue, and then in reality, it doesn't always work out that each issue has 80%. And we may want to select a journal that has an average of 80% annually, but may not have it, especially if there's a small number of articles per issue. All right, then the next question is, my journal was not selected for ERIC. If we fix all the issues you made us aware of, will you reevaluate it right away? So the answer for that is that the updated policy requires a 2-year waiting period for all journals reviewed but not selected. And this gives the publisher time to fully establish and incorporate the changes that have been implemented and for us to see those changes. And then when we approve your journal, after that period and we get that agreement signed, we typically do go back and add some older issues. So we're not saying the issues you publish today won't be in ERIC. We just are going to wait to make sure that these changes take effect over a longer period of time. We have a follow-up question of, can you ask for metrics on a specific article? That is always something you can ask. I can't make any guarantees, but feel free to send a request for what the specific article is with the ED or EJ number or the URL. We can get it from there, and we can send those metrics out. Okay. I see one more question, so I want everyone to have a chance to ask any additional questions before we wrap up. And I'm going to ask the one remaining question that I see. All right, so do you try to have an equal number of sources across all 16 topic areas? And if not, do you have priority do you have one area more priority than another? And so the answer to this is those 16 topic areas came from legislation, not from us, the current ERIC team necessarily today, deciding if we were to choose how to divide up the topics in groups, how we would group them. So during each review cycle, we search for sources in all topic areas, but we know it's not possible to index an equal number of sources across all 16 topic areas because there just is an equal distribution. And so prior to each review cycle, we review the most current collection analysis to identify underserved areas and emerging trends, and to stay aware of topics with fewer sources. And we found there are just more journals produced in some areas because some topics are bigger. So higher education and teacher education normally have more journals than urban education and rural education. All right, so I don't see any more questions. I'm gonna, while I wrap up, if there's anything that comes in, I will answer it. Also, if you have any questions on other parts of ERIC, we are happy to take those questions as well. Oh, something came in. Can you get a transcript of this presentation? We will be posting this on YouTube, and the YouTube should have the, will be closed captioned, and you should be able to get a transcript from there. If you can't, again, email ericrequests@ed.gov, and we can send you. It won't be like a nicely formatted transcript, but we can send you the copy of the archive presentation. All right. So we're going to stop here for today, but you can send us any other thoughts or questions about what we covered today to ericrequests@ed.gov. Thank you so much for joining us.